Good morning, Shanghai. Good morning, Design Shanghai. It's good morning in London as well. I'm Aidan Walker. It's my privilege, my pleasure and my delight to be the conference program director of the Design Shanghai Forum, and equally, if not more, a privilege, a pleasure and delight for me to be sitting here with Thomas Heatherwick, who has been called one of England's most significant designers, and who I believe is actually one of China's most significant designers also. He is many, many different things, but one of the things he is not is an architect, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. He has a very long and profound creative relationship with China, and indeed with Shanghai particularly. What I want us to do is to cover what you might call the Heatherwick Studio philosophy of design, design as a reflection, design as intuition, and then move in more detail into the work that Thomas is doing in China particularly and in Shanghai particularly. Everybody knows about the Bund Finance Center, the West Bund. There's another big project, West Bund, which is coming on stream now, and of course nobody in Shanghai could possibly not be aware of the 1,000 trees. Thomas, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm really happy to be part of this forum. China and particularly Shanghai have transformed this studio and how we think about what we do, and our friends and collaborators in China are very beloved, and so I'm thrilled to be speaking in China, in London, via a pandemic with you, yeah. And to share a passion for making with you.
Well, it's, I mean, as you know, as I'm sure you do, I've been trying to get you to come to China for many years, but now here you are coming to China, so that's also good.
Well, I've been going to China many, many times.
Yeah,
It's just the timing hasn't quite worked, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it goes back, doesn't it? Your relationship with China goes back. Does it go earlier than the Shanghai Expo 2010?
Yeah, I first went to China 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, and we were looking at different craft processes that were going around. I mean, the incredible craftsmanship that still exists in China that here in the UK has been sort of pulling back and less. And there have been friends of the studio who are really sort of encouraging that collaboration with the creativity and craftsmanship that exists in China. And also, I mean, China's, since I was little, seemed to be the most opposite to the UK in terms of that. I mean, the UK got stuck thinking of itself as a old history and queens and castles and deep heritage, and that somehow the rest of the world was developing. But then you look at China, you know, in terms of the age and depth of the culture that exists in China, that is there to learn from, be inspired by, and to humble that Europe-centric mindset that can easily exist.
Yeah.
That, yes, in the last century or so, the colonial legacy was very powerful, but I think I've been very inspired by the progress that was happening in the East, in China, and not just the progress from a Western point of view.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, for having started Design Shanghai, well, we started kind of planning it in 2013, and the first edition was in 2014. And at the time we were asking questions, as you know, we generate a theme for each edition of the show, or of the forum. And at the time we were talking about China much more as a manufacturing powerhouse than as an original design powerhouse. But I think that I have been able to see, and I know the colleagues that I work with on the exhibition and the forum have also been able to see an emerging generation of Chinese designers who recognize, respect and draw from those ancient craft traditions, you know. For me, it's mostly about wood. As I say, I was working in wood for one of the periods of my long and disreputable life. But as a, you know, would you describe yourself as a craftsman? Do you think you have intelligent fingers?
Well, I've built my first building when I was 21, and up until that point, I'd been making things.
What building was it? Tell us about it.
It was a pavilion. When I realised that all the people studying to design buildings had never made anything, And ever since I was small, I was making things. If you had an idea, you would start trying to make it. I mean, my home had a workshop in it because my mother was an artist and a craftsperson, and so we had tools all around, and there were kilns, and she was also doing enameling, so there were pots of powdered glass and different chemicals, probably terribly toxic for a child, but it engendered in me the sense of if you have an idea, you try it. And that certainly was true in the world of ceramics and glass and cabinet making and metalwork. You tried, and ideas came out from that hands-on process. And it fascinated me that there was an absolute wall, like glass wall of divide in the mindset when that making changed scale to the scale of city. And suddenly there was this glass box around a very cerebral world, as something that was intellectualized, very academic led. I guess it'd been a bit paralyzed by, in the West, a lack of investment, and so the notion of the paper architect was very powerful when I was growing up. The idea that to me is sort of absolute, you'll never build anything that you design because there wasn't the endorsement and belief in that progress. So there was this world that had removed itself, celebrated not making, and meanwhile the buildings that were being built seemed so sterile. And the mindset of form follows function, ornament is a crime, and less is more, they were powerful. And I think I've been grappling over the last 2 decades to really understand what drove those.
You don't believe those things, those principles?
Well, I am a functionalist.
Yes.
I actually do, but I believe that everyone was forgetting something. And it was actually when we did some work for Harley Davidson, you know, who've been crafting incredible motorbikes for many, many
I've got my own
years.
opinions about Harley Davidson,
but,
if you want to get onto motorbikes.
Willie Davidson, who was head of the design of the bikes, at one point said, and his grandson told us, form follows function, but both report to emotion. And it's been clear for me, and it chimed with what we were thinking here anyway, which is that the function was defined too narrowly. And the assumption was that if you follow the very base function, stop the rain, get light, keep somebody warm, that you follow that the outcome ergo must be beautiful. And that beauty, I think, was a shorthand for emotion. And it forgot that how you feel is an emotion. And so we are very aware that you've got to think about the user and think about how will they feel, what's their journey of experiential contact with building the world around us, the public space. And it's just this huge missing element. And I think that this chimed also with the sense that central government did projects after the Second World War. So things were being done to people, and then the role of the architect was there to know better than people what they needed, and do it to them. So people experienced. I think it's a funny time because we've had phenomenal progress in medicine, phenomenal progress in technology. You know, if you took someone from 200 years ago now and said, look how long people live now, look how they can communicate with each other, look at the things we can stop you from dying from, but you then also showed the buildings we now build everywhere, the same, whether it's in Asia or Europe, near the equator, near the Arctic Circle. the emotional experience is really impoverished. I think they would really think, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
And so in my studio's work, we have been really trying to not feel that we have all the answers and that we're there to tell you what something should be, but to try and grow the right projects.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember hearing that there's someone I met, his grandfather was a property developer, and he said a lovely expression. He said, a good city is a garden for growing good people. And it feels, when you look with that lens and you go, does this place make people the best versions of themselves and encourage us to be great? And you look at, in general, the new swathes of city, and you really can't say that they do. They define function very narrowly, and efficiency and words like that. Yeah. But without, and then the climate crisis has come so powerfully into our minds. Yeah. And again, often without emotional sustainability being thought of at the same time. Yeah. So things are being championed that use minimum energy or have minimum carbon in their construction. But data has shown that buildings built within the last 60 years are twice as likely to be demolished sooner than buildings older than 60 years. Yes, yes. And that's not sustainable. You know, I think we talk about the airline industry, and we talk about when you compare the construction industry, I think it's 40% of all emissions are the construction industry. That's what it is. It's way smaller for the aviation. And yet we don't build that real emotional sustainability as a factor into the places we build. And what I've found exciting in China is that I feel that in my studio's work, that pre to that, there's this idea that creativity is just there and you just are creative. I don't find that. Yeah. And what, for us, ideas come from criticism. It may not sound good, but you start by thinking what you don't want to do. Yeah. And from that, often it helps you know what should happen or inspires a solution. And what's exciting, I think, in my experience with our friends and collaborators in China, is that there has been a phase in China of rapid growth and copying models in America or Europe and building. And I feel that there are young people just looking, going, no. Yeah. Why is that good? Yeah. Yeah. And there is the nourishing and nurturing of creativity, but I think it starts from moments of going, why? Why are we doing? Why would we do that? Yeah, yeah. And there's the confidence to ask why, and that you're already half the way there. Yeah. Sometimes when we've had creative block, you stop and you don't know what you should do. But if you just think, hang on, that's not good. Just the act of realizing something isn't good, you're already half the way there to what the solution could be. Right. And I think that's, for me, a big reason why I think exciting progress is happening within China as people start to have that confidence to feel, hang on, maybe they don't have the answer, and what we need is things that feel more particular to here, aren't just copycat versions, and just really question the logics that made these soulless places that we are so used to. And I'm not talking about rich people's houses, because they're always fancy. Yeah. And I'm not talking about art galleries, because they're always fancy. Because people go, art, let's make it artistic. Yeah. But I'm talking about the generality, the 95% of new buildings that get built. Yeah. And money's a very real force. But when you analyze the life cycle and put money into the mix, there are strong reasons, I believe, for why buildings should have humanity in them. There you go. Humanity was something else. So the humanizing is the factor that has driven us over the last 26 years here in the different projects that we're doing, and is, I think, a deep belief for us that you don't really make sustainable places if you don't emotionally feel good about them, then whatever someone says, some data, and gives you a talk and scares you about this, that, or the other, we are driven by our passions and emotions and experiences, and you don't have to have studied architecture or design or art. Everyone's clever, everyone feels things, and we need to trust people's feelings and believe in them and notice them. And in the studio, we're trying to think from the user out rather than come in with, you're wrong, I have the answer. How can you really have the confidence to think that you do have that answer?
Thomas, it turns out that, I had 59 questions for you. It turns out I only need to ask you one.
Is that because I just talk too much?
No, it's absolutely perfect, because it is so much, A, what I personally myself feel, and B, with my kind of comparatively limited knowledge of your work and of the work of the studio, one of the things that I've read about you saying is that you view the design process as something like a detection process, like a crime story, And there's another one where you end up with three-dimensional design because you don't like to see the silos of architecture, ceramics, product design, metal design, whatever it is. And I was thinking, in fact, on the train up here, I was making a note saying to myself, if you have the design in 3 dimensions, which is, long, high, and broad, there are other dimensions. There's the dimension of time, which has to do with the things that you bring in when you bring movement into your work, into your buildings, like the Bund Finance Center with the moving facade, which I know we're going to see in the film, and the rolling bridge here in the UK, and then emotion being the 5th and possibly the most important dimension of design at all. People have to respond. So if we go back then to what drives you in design, did you consider architecture as a career and reject it? Did you say, no, I don't want to do that? How did you come to the Royal College of Art, and what kind of design did you want to do? I mean, I can tell you what my first response to the first thing of yours that I saw, which was the Harvey Nichols windows.
Oh yeah.
Which was from 1997. That's 24 years ago. I was editing a design magazine here in the UK, and I was looking at this thing going, I've never seen anything like that. Not only had I not seen anything like it, I'd never come across anyone who thought that way, whose thinking seemed to come from a completely different mindset than the one that I was used to, being a critic of design, call it. So it's a very, my question is almost as long as your answer, is what is it that drives you really? Why didn't you go to be an architect? You're doing huge architectural projects. Or have you answered that already?
Your question's an amazing question. I'm just enjoying your question, so I'm trying to think how to say something as good as your question back. Maybe I'll just jump around to some examples. It's surprised. One example is that when we worked on the London buses, for example, I found it very interesting, the different mindsets that people have. So I suppose if I use the child as a way to frame the point, as a child, whether you just go out into the world, and if there's a thing standing there, you think, what's that thing? If there's a thing, you get on, or if there's a thing, you walk inside, or there's things that you put things in, they're all the world of space and things. And then later, something's called, that's called automotive design, and then sort of, no, that's called architecture. No, that's product design, that's sculpture. And then there's these sort of whole communities in and around that make themselves feel good, and mindsets attached to those. But my response came from criticism, thinking why I couldn't. the art galleries I went into all looked gorgeous and amazing, but whenever I went near a new school, it was horrific.
Yeah.
When I went on the new buses, they were so bad. You know, I couldn't understand why the lighting was like in a battery chicken farm. You know, with fluorescent tube this far away from your face that made your girlfriend look bad and you look bad to your girlfriend or things like that. And so some things seem to think about experience, and some things just seem to think about, well, I'll get someone from here to there. So when we worked on the London bus, we were aware that if we had been designing a 2-story building in the centre of London, we would have had to spend a lot of time not just designing it, but working with the city council where that building was to make sure they were happy that it was in keeping with that piece of the city. And we would have also had to work with one of the design advisory panels that exist in London that you know about, who then would advise to make sure that the council is making the right kind of decision and supports this. And then you also would have to have your client who is happy. And all. But when we were designing a bus, we were designing a 2-story building, and it happened to be on wheels. And instead of one, in London there are 7,000 double-decker buses. So you're more likely to see one of those 2-story buildings than any building in London, even any single building. But there was no sense of, there was no panel we had to go to talk about how it fitted in with London. I was even asked, you know, is it going to be red or not red? It was, and I just found that so sort of hilarious that if it's called infrastructure, that's different, and yet it's got, so I'm trying to be true to what's the impact on that child. You know, the buses are going to have probably more impact on that child than that any one building, because there's 7,000 of them. I'm using that as just an example of, well, why isn't that, is that art? Or is it architecture? Or is it, who cares? It's all things that you experience around you. And for a while when we were starting up, some of the only commissions we could do were called public art. And I found that it's a sort of hilarious area, because public art, by the fact that it was located in a place, needed to understand that place. And so we won every competition we went in for when we were starting, because those were the only ones we could do, because we thought about how it fitted into the place. The idea that art was just, no, here's me and my art, couldn't compete with something really looking at context. And so then when you think about human experience, you're trying to sort of boil down to the real function. So the window you saw at Harvey Nichols, we were asked to design the windows. But when you stop and think, why are you asking the window? What you really mean isn't, can you design the windows? What you're really saying is, could you make people be interested in this building and its contents? And when you say, well, can you make people be interested in this building? You start thinking, well, what normally happens? And what normally happens is there's things behind the glass, and there's lots of things, and they normally have nothing to do with the building. And so we just tried to go back further steps to think about the emotional experience of people. If something is what you think it's likely to be, you don't look more. But when something isn't what you expect, you look, suddenly you are, the word arousal is, you know, your mind is aroused, not sexually. But, and so you then, from that, leads a sort of chain of thoughts. And when I was little, I also got interested in computers, and Clive Sinclair had invented the ZX81 computer. I got one of these, and I did coding, and the coding was called BASIC. And in BASIC, it was very basic. It was if this, then this.
Then that,
If this, then this. And from the accumulation of many if this, then this, if this, then this, you could, it led you to unusual outcomes or that you could program in. So in a sense, our projects are trying to be driven by what's the real objective. And the Harvey Nichols project, by deliberately not behaving according to the typical format, we could have people pay more attention and achieve the objective. And so in each project, it's this strategic thinking at the beginning, and whether that's a piece of city or a headquarters for an organization like Google, it's always about that initial thinking that I think the best projects, if you can manage to get that strong, it's like a manifesto for a project that you try to clarify and then design. It'll tell you what you need to do, but it's an if this, then if this, and that can lead to unusual solutions. So at the World Expo, the Shanghai World Expo, we'd been given half the budget of the other Western nations, but we'd all been given the same size site. And at the same moment on the planet were 250 design teams all thinking, what shall I do for our national pavilion? So we didn't have another building to think, oh, this is what Italy's doing next to us, and this is what France is going to do, and this is what the Netherlands are doing. How can we gauge? But what we did know is what the trends in architecture are. And you can, and it's very, people are very predictable actually. Trends, you look through design magazines as you do, and it's very predictable what everyone's doing. Just to finish the UK pavilion story, we second guessed what everyone was likely to do and then thought, so we mustn't do that.
We mustn't do that.
And also, if we had half the budget, we must do one of the smallest pavilions. But if we did one of the biggest, it would act against us anyway, because there was a height restriction of 20 meters. So our site was 100 meters wide, 20 meters high. You end up with a letterbox proportion that wouldn't even fit in an image well. And by doing a smaller one, it would fit in the image and weirdly look bigger, when in images that are a compelling part of the ingredient that makes people go to things. So it was our analysis that meant that by analysing what others were likely to do, it led us to think, well, we'll do the other way, which is extreme texture, and that in turn could lead us. And when we won the top prize at the expo, it felt, well, that's because we analysed this logically and used the resource strategically.
It's not just a logical analysis though, is it? I mean, it's underneath it, as you say, it's humanity and emotion and all those things. Can we draw that back?
Well, the question is though, whether emotion is logical, I guess maybe then. Because in a sense, human response, and there is a logical side to that, which is thinking how feelings are. But maybe logic, we've got so used to the idea that logic is a hard, rigid, mechanistic way that we think, no, it's another thing. But in a sense, there are logical ways that we respond to places. It doesn't mean that you can exactly predict, you can't. But you can be tuning into that and really interested in that. But I think that there's a mindset in the design world that's somehow cowing to focus group thinking rather than actually being inspired by human response. And I'm not interested in the sense that you're just trying to make the broadest possible people happy a bit. I want to make people really engaged with something. Otherwise, I don't have enough chance to make so much pieces of city. So little of the world around us, people like myself, and there are many other good designers and architects, get to do. So with those bits, you want to make the biggest difference that you can.
Thomas, regenerative design, Shanghai particularly, all mega cities are suffering from pollution. Everybody's talking about electric vehicles. Tell us about the car.
Well, we were thrilled to have the chance to work with IM because we were nervous actually in the very first conversation with them, and sort of said, well, we're not conventional automotive designers, and they said, well, that's why we want you to work on this. And so as we started thinking about it, and I mean, every car company is making an electric car, and so we sort of felt like, oh no, it gets back to the same styling and shaping and we just felt that wasn't interesting to us. And suddenly we realized these two things. One was that, is it really enough to just go around saying, well, I'm not adding more pollutants to the air?
Yeah.
And so then thought, well, why can't you, we've all been filtering air in the last year or so during this pandemic with all these masks.
Yeah.
And just thought, well, if there are going to be potentially 1 million of these cars in China and thousands in other parts of the world, what if, rather than not just putting out fossil fuel pollutants, what if this is regenerating the air around and taking the pollutants from the buses and lorries and other cars out? Because the fantastic thing about cars is they themselves are diffused all around the places where people are.
Yeah.
And we all know the gravity of the impact of those pollutants on us. That's becoming clearer now. And designing Google's headquarters, they've been very aware of air quality for a long time. So just seeing, well, if you combined vacuuming with filtering, with the new battery technologies that are coming out, we could make a difference. It could really make a difference. But the other side was the space crisis that we've been experiencing, again, particularly with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so many of us are not able to have the space you really want, or that extra space that has also led to, I think, many mental health issues all around us.
For sure.
And it's really powerful when you stop and think that there are 1.4 billion cars on the planet, and then you say, well, 90% of the time those cars aren't going anywhere.
Yeah.
And the thinking with cars, when they've spoken about multi-use spaces, it's been very much about while they're driving along, what you could do while driving. But if you say, okay, well, let's put that aside, 90% of the time these cars are sitting there. So if you've got 2 or 3 square meters per car, that's billions of square meters of real estate unused. And if you see someone sitting in their car, if you see a man sitting in their car by themselves, you think, have you had an argument with your spouse or something like that? And so just thought, well, what's going on there? And the conventional driving position is facing forwards. But what if you choose to, this will have autonomous driving ability, but you could choose then, when driving's over, whoever drove, whether it drove itself or someone enjoyed driving, it's got to be great to drive. But if the driving position, those seats can turn around, and you think of it more like, for many of us, the stereo system in our car is better than in our house. I don't know if you've experienced that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Often the seats are more comfortable than actually a seat in your house. So I thought, well, how weird again that they're not being used. So if you have 4 seats and you have fold-out tables so that you can get a quite big, like we're based around a table that folds out, that means you can have a meeting, it's like this den, room, shed, whatever you call it, but there's real needs for places to work, places for programming, gaming, eating, socializing. But then you really start getting the advantage that it can be wherever you want it to be. And if the doors are sort of like these sort of French sliding doors, it suddenly means that wherever you are in the world, you've got that ability to connect a little bit more also with nature. So, I mean, there's a lot more I could talk about.
There's a lot more I could ask about.
But trying to take it very seriously about making a room, because it's also affordable. Cars are surprisingly, if this costs about 40,000 euros, to buy an extra room for your house is probably going to cost a lot more than 40,000 euros. But this has already got, I mean, this is where the advantages of production kick in, and people have been talking about with architecture, how can we get the advantages of mass production to impact architecture? And maybe it's sort of partly been under our noses all the time. So the next phase will be a development phase over the next 2 years or so. So hopefully we'll be able to carry that through. And the final thing was that the combining glass, which has the ability to go opaque, because privacy is obviously a thing. You want to be able to be private, and it makes a bed, makes a generous double bed. So It seemed that
So
that
it's the
might
answer to the
make
world's
it move.
problems.
I'm not sure it's the world's problems, but many little things add up,
Yeah.
I think, and that's what we're interested in all our projects.
It's a very typical kind of Heatherwick thinking approach. We need to talk about 1,000 trees. We haven't got much time. So can you draw some of what you've been saying to that project? Can you tell us how those ideas inform the project that everybody in Shanghai is now going, oh my God, here it comes?
The 1,000 Trees project came after the World Expo, and suddenly we just had conversations that we'd never had before with city officials and with property developers who saw the UK pavilion, but were just saying, what would you do? And the UK had felt so focused on style. If there was someone in the UK who did a curvy building, they would assume that if you then say, could you make me an office building, they assume it's going to be a curvy office building. Yeah. Or if someone's the square person, of course it would be square. Yeah. Whereas we found in China, that was not the case. They saw the ambition and sort of goals that something had achieved, and then they were asking us, and this has been in many different projects, what would you do for us, without the baggage of assuming that we would, which would be ludicrous, that we would do hairy buildings to solve every solution. They didn't think that. And it was so refreshing. The 1,000 Trees project really came from an interest and a connecting with the client group who were saying that they didn't want to make the sort of crazy luxury. This was a district that could have something that was humbler in the brands that would be there, and the shops and spaces and learning spaces and gallery space, and we were inspired by that to think how we could make a large development, and so many things in China are big. Yeah, it is big. And that's been one of the biggest challenges I'm interested in, is how do you make pieces of city when humans are still roughly the same size we were? You know, our ancestors 500,000 years ago probably were roughly the same size we are now. And therefore there's sort of human truths about how we experience the world, and just pumping up bigger and bigger and bigger has, I think, contributed to the deadness and inhumanity of so many pieces of city. So trying to break this down felt important. The use of nature in the 1,000 Trees project.
This is one of the early models.
I mean, we did, that was an idea before we found the 1,000 Trees logic, but there was an intuition which was saying this area is getting more and more concrete buildings and less connection to nature. And we know that we have a budgetary challenge of materials that we can use, and we know that we need something that is softening. And why do we always push nature away? And why don't we let nature be a key component of this project? And it's not, there's this sort of very simplistic way people say, oh, so do you think you're solving the climate crisis because you have a few trees? And it's kind of, well, no, not at all. We're fully aware that solving the climate crisis is an immense issue and involves many initiatives. But the emotional crisis is an ingredient as well. And making something, nature is certainly something that can be a counterpoint to the hardness and severity of big buildings, and the necessity to use specifiable materials that are affordable to put together. But we were using nature in big part for its emotional job and heavy lifting that it could do. And we realized we needed 1,000 columns to make this grid of this structure of this project work, that would include car parking, would include service spaces, places that people would sleep in, teach children in, and hopefully have the best ideas of their life in. But once you had that grid, you started to gridderize, and the rigidity was starting. But nature's also very heavy. You know, if you want to put wet soil properly, give nutrients and space for something to grow, and you're not playing a kind of hydroponic game of science, barely keeping life going with a few little drops of water. Yeah. We wanted the heartiness, and that means heavy greenery. So if we were to put a green roof on here, it would, those beams would be much deeper, and our ceiling would be lower, and the emotional impact for people in here would change. So we're thinking, that's heavy. If we just have green roofs, that we've got a real challenge. But if we had all these columns, and they go straight to the foundations, if we could put that weight directly on top of the columns, the load would transfer straight to the foundations, and we wouldn't need to have these lower ceilings everywhere. And so it was a mix of many different factors, but it was really exciting when the city were excited about the idea, the people working on it, and it meant we could take away silly ideas of luxury as being fancy materials everywhere. It was the courage to do an idea by the city and the developers that would be the experiential necessity. I don't want to use the word luxury, but something that could give somewhere its own personality and spirit. We are also keeping lots of the old buildings that otherwise so often get crushed and destroyed, and accepting weirdness. Often the role of the architect is tidying it up, cleaning everything up. And I think it's in the places we love, though, often have weirdnesses and anomalies and things that don't quite work. So there are bits where we've built over the old building that was there, and you could say, well, that's not very perfect.
It's not
and I'm
cool.
accepting imperfection. And there's no cladding on the columns. The columns are raw cast. So I hope that this will feel like something that really is embedded, and we grew this specially for this site in Shanghai, and I think every site needs something that gives it its own thing. And I think too often there's this sort of, I am right and I'm going to do my rightness to everywhere in the world. Whereas what we're trying to do is evolve things that feel special, because anyone can tell when something is cynical and sort of feels like a formula just being rolled out. A child can tell that and feel it. I remember being able to tell, and nobody needed to teach me or show or point. You can just feel it. And so I hope with the different projects we do, that if nothing else, someone can feel wholeheartedness. And it's a long process. I mean, we started 1,000 Trees 9 years ago. And in a sense, you just have to be determined year after year. But I do believe that sort of perseverance eventually does things do happen. It does make a difference.
It does.
So I'm excited that later this year people will be able to start going in and using the first half of it.
I need to stop you. I wish I didn't. I think we could have, we could talk for hours.
I think we could.
Thomas, it's really, really great to hear. I mean, I think we've only scratched the surface. I think what we should do is a series of films, but just for that kind of 30-odd minutes of emotional intelligence. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you for including me. I really appreciate it.
Well, Design Shanghai thanks you.
Great. Thank you.